Okay, thank you everyone for joining the webinar, Answering Tough Questions on the Future of Security. Pretty excited about this one. But before we get started, let's go through a few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded. You can get it up on our website as you can all of our other recordings and all of our other webinars, a lot of content up there. We'll, of course, want to make sure that because it is answering the tough questions, you're asking questions. So feel free to jump in anytime in the question and answer bar. We'll be answering those, filtering them in, making sure that we have a good flow of information. But absolutely anything that you're looking to get answered today from our experts, we definitely want to hear from you. My name is Stephen Marshowitz. I am the program director here at TrustedSec. And what we like to say is generally we would do a trends review normally in this time, but because of what we've seen out there and so many things happen, I don't know if anything's happening today. It seems like a big day going on out there. So we wanted to really go in and get in some trends reviews, understand where things are going, really build some good emotion today. So good to get some good karma out of this discussion. So with that, TrustedSec, a little bit about us. We really try and build in the best of class consultants in everything that we do. We have multiple different practices. Remediation has been very big for us. Obviously, we're known for penetration testing, a lot of advisory service work lately, but everything we do, we're always looking to bring you the best possible quality that we can. And we do that by having engagements started by senior level consultants. We really have flipped the model of consulting, whereas most consulting organizations will be at the top of the pyramid. They'll have a few people that really know what they're doing and everyone else are a bunch of juniors. We have flipped that and we have mostly senior led people, pretty much everyone. And they're in the organization is really, really dedicated to security, knows a lot about it, and really brings a lot of value to you. So with that, wanted to introduce our presenters today. Our esteemed CEO, Dave Kennedy, who needs no introduction. He's DerbyCon, there he is, DerbyCon, pen test, everything else. He's been able to do talking everywhere. I'm really excited to have him. And then our esteemed practice lead expert, who does need some introduction, Justin Leapline. Oh, I would say there's no one person that knows all there is to know about security and compliance, but Justin just might be that one person that does. So with that, we'll get started right off the bat. Welcome you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we'll give him an easy one just to get started. Okay, cloud computing. With everything that's happening, is it all just going to be Amazon, Microsoft, and Google? Will we have to worry about security at all in the future?
So yes, you're going to have to worry about it. Even going to any type of the big players in the cloud computing, you're still going to have to worry about it. It might be a little bit different architecture than we're used to as an on-premise type of thing. But even beyond that, the biggest thing with the big three is the ease of adoption. Anybody can get a free account, go on AWS and kick up servers within, minutes, type of thing. There are other players out there. There are people taking advantage of it, like Heroku or Netlify or something like that just need quick, low infrastructure that they don't need to manage anything, but can spin up a website fairly quickly. And we even have some other providers out there that they serve different markets, and oftentimes, they're data center providers that have virtualization, but they offer a better cost, on a per computing basis. And people that deal with like a lot of video or a lot of data storage oftentimes can get better pricing with that. But in any of those cases, security is a little bit different in each of those aspects. And it's also different whether you're dealing with, full-fledged just VMs, launching it up, or whether you're doing a serverless environment, all those take different aspects to consider how to layer in security into it.
I think you still look at a lot of companies are in a hybrid model. There's no company. I mean, I would say the majority of companies out there still have some sort of on-premise infrastructure, right? Whether that's your end users and your workstation infrastructure, or obviously certain things like Office 365 and what you get from an Azure perspective. The ability to scale your workforce in an easy way that works both on and off premise is very desirable. So, I think there's definitely still a mixture of both on and off prem, right? And I don't think that's going to be going away anytime soon. I think a lot of smaller organizations and companies can get away with that, but as you start to build out the building blocks of your network infrastructure and everything else that you need to maintain and support, hybrid models become more of a desirable state as things go along. And stating that though, out of the past 12 cloud engagements that I've been on, 11 of those we've been able to compromise. And usually that's due to lack of understanding around the cloud infrastructure itself, how it's designed and architected, permissions. You may have two-factor authentication on one, Microsoft endpoint, but then you look at other ones and you don't. So there's still a lot of concern around cloud infrastructure, especially when it comes to, the applications that you're installing, the services that you're providing, what you're doing from a end user perspective and how they authenticate and how they go into systems, how administration works, still going after the endpoints. And then from there, moving into your cloud infrastructure is definitely something that is still very doable from an attacker standpoint, something that we leverage very heavily. So, there's risks associated with doing things on premise. There's risks associated with cloud infrastructure. And so regardless of what provider you're using, whether it's Google for Business or Azure or, Amazon Web Services or AWS, security needs to be designed really instinctively to the architecture of how you're building things, how you promote the applications within there. Patch management is still an issue. Visibility is probably the biggest issue that we see for most of these organizations is just having an understanding around what's actually happening in their cloud environment. A lot of times logs are delayed over 24 hours, 24-hour period in some of these cloud provider services. Sometimes getting access to the same type of data and logs becomes very challenging. So all of those really need to be understood upfront or as you're going through the implementation of these to ensure that you have equal visibility as you would an on-premise solution, because you still want to identify when you have a breach. That's, when major issues occur. If you look at just the most recent SolarWinds data breach that occurred, Azure was or Office 365 and Azure was a main component of that, where there was multiple compromises occurring in that infrastructure that people didn't identify or detect because the visibility there is extremely low for most organizations. I'm not saying you can't do it. It's just extremely low for most organizations. So, having the same type of visibility in your cloud provider as you do on your on-premise is absolutely critical to ensure that you can at least respond to things much more effectively in cloud infrastructure versus not. But to me, it doesn't matter if you're in the cloud or if you're on premise, same security exposures or risks are there. It's just in somebody else's different infrastructure.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. The average cost of a breach globally is almost $4 million, according to Ponemon and Cisco. In your experience, has any breach ever cost that much from what you've seen?
Yes, absolutely.
I think it depends on the size of the organization, right, and the extent of the data breach. A lot of things are called data breaches. Some organizations consider malware infections data breaches, right? Excuse me. When you start getting down into the specifics, if you're saying on average, it really depends on the size and extent and how long the attackers had access to your infrastructure. How do you put a monetary value on something like SolarWinds when you had attackers that were in your environment for over 6 months? That you had no idea that they were there, and now you're going back retroactively 6 months trying to figure out the systems that they had access to, the damages, and how do you even make direct damages off of that? It was allegedly taken by a nation state like Russia. Are there direct damages that actually impact your intellectual property, that actually impact your software products? I think you could say something like SolarWinds, their stock dropped, I think 27% and hasn't really rebounded very much since then. They've had a substantial monetary impact because of that directly. But data breaches in general really comes down to the type of information that was taken. Are there loss of records or consumer information or customer information, and the amount of time it takes for things like incident response, reporting, brand reputational damage, all those come into there. And I think when you start looking at certain types of categories like ransomware, for example, the numbers are absolutely up there. When you start looking at things like nation state attacks, it might be a little bit different. It's very hard to quantitatively say $4 million was taken from an intellectual property theft perspective if you're getting hacked by China. But long-term wise, it might be substantially larger than that if you're grabbing all the R&D secrets for your company that are being used now, to compete with you in the same type of market. So, I think, when you look at just traditional data breaches and you look at ransomware, I think the 4 million numbers, definitely a pretty average number that we would see across the board for organizations, and it's only increasing more because they're trying to maximize the amount of damage they can do towards organizations to maximize the amount of return that they have.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the numbers that you're talking about, like there's the direct impact cost. So hiring teams out to get forensics done or remediation from tooling or whatever that is. What's really never kind of reported, it's always estimated, is like how much work your team actually put into it to remediate it, to fix it, to adjust process, to get your legal team involved, to do, notifications out to all your consumers for all the different states that have their own data breach, notifications. All that kind of adds up and adds into that number there, and everything. And so it easily goes to 4 million. I know when we're at Secure State, we're working with a company that they only had 4,000, I think, records of PCI data that actually got hacked. Their direct costs turned out to be $1.2 million. And that was after the reissuance costs, the fines that they paid from Visa and MasterCard, and that was there, and they almost went out of business, type of thing. So it's very easy, even at small ones, that the indirect costs add up a lot. And, it's the immeasurable impact to that. So all those engineers, they could have been working on features, meanwhile, 3 months go by and all they're doing is remediation work, type of thing.
And it'll be interesting. You look at, and I hate to keep bringing back SolarWinds because that's what's hot right now, but you look at SolarWinds, and what's interesting about that one specifically is that the group that was originally alleged for the shadow brokers data breach for the NSA, the Equation Group stuff that occurred, the same registrar registered a domain name that basically said they have SolarWinds source code that they're going to be publishing out or releasing based on a certain bid. So now you have, a closed source product that is their revenue streams from Orion, allegedly 18,000 customers, comes from this closed source product, and that these attackers are now alleging that they're going to open source it. So you look at the ramifications that it had just in the initial impact on the data breach itself, and how they used the update mechanisms to compromise a lot of other folks as well. And then you have the potential ramifications long term of that source code being published and the potential impact to that actual software product itself. So you're probably looking at a much larger data breach, in the sense of something like SolarWinds, because it's hit their stock prices, it's hit their potential brand and reputational aspects of things, the amount of money that's going in. They have two big firms coming in doing the incident response that's still ongoing. It's been ongoing for months. You have, you have the government coming in and doing their analysis. You have, and then all the, after fact items that are happening as part of that. I guarantee you they're dedicating all their resources directly to this specific data breach when all their other products are probably lacking the attention that they need. So, it's going to be a substantial one with these types of supply chain attacks have a much larger impact on damage.
So do you think SolarWinds will come back from this at all?
I think so. I mean, I don't think this is going to be a company ending thing, but it definitely has the potential to be.
Yeah.
When you're a trusted partner within an organization, and your update mechanisms are compromised and you're pushing out malware to other people, especially large companies like Microsoft and Cisco and VMware and, all of this, all these big companies, Belkin was in that too, I think. Number of companies compromised by this, and then thousands of others potentially impacted. If you look at the command and controls that were registered, those are all, a really big hit on the confidence level from security. And people, especially in the security teams, are going to be looking at SolarWinds saying, do we really need this in our environment, especially with the excessive permissions it needs? Are there ways for us to offload this into a different infrastructure so that it doesn't have as much impact to our piece? And that's really when you start looking at how do we design our infrastructures to really stop these type of supply chain attacks anyways. And it's alleged that there was not just one actor inside of SolarWinds, there was multiple, that they've been owned by several nation states and several organizations had been in there. So I mean, yes, it's going to have a reputational damage, I think, for a long time for SolarWinds, but I think they can definitely rebound and recover from it.
Yeah, we've seen some other examples of like breaches like Heartland and stuff that nature where, they'll get bought out by pennies on the dollar later, and then maybe get rebranded and come out, with same products under Cisco or something like that, type of thing. One thing I thought it was interesting, it was years ago, I saw a presentation at ShmooCon where they basically did an analysis on long-term impacts to breaches. And one of the things they came out with that most of the companies they looked at a year later after the initial impact, they were actually at the same or above stock price with that type of thing. So
I want to say there was one exception to that, which was some certificate issuing company. I can't remember the name of them offhand. But this is going several years back, and they actually went out of business because of the data breach. But it's far and few between. Like there's not many companies that directly go out of business directly related to a specific data breach.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree.
All right, we got a tough one. So answering the tough questions. How can we completely remediate responder threat? LLMNR, NetBIOS, and now DHP over IPv6 vectors. What else can we do to put that to bed?
Yeah, I can take that one. So LLMNR, local link multicast name resolution protocol, and NBNS, NetBIOS name services, are specifically due to essentially broadcast queries that occur on the network. So when your computer goes to resolve DNS, it has a little bit of a way to cut down DNS traffic on your network through multicast. And what happens is it sends out a request saying, hey, file server 1, are you there? And if an attacker has something like Responder or Invade in place, they can say, yep, I'm file server 1, connect to me, and I'll pass you the credentials as things go through. There are ways of turning off LLMNR and MBNS, either both through registry modifications or through group policy, that effectively shut those down. The same thing for auto discovery through like WPAD. You can also shut that down as well, so that those types of responder and invade queries aren't there by default. What I would heavily recommend, is disallowing intercommunication traffic of SMB and RPC, especially when it comes to workstation to workstation communication. You don't need that. A workstation shouldn't be able to communicate to somebody else on the local subnet ranges in their own environments over our SMB RPC. So getting more towards minimization of ports and protocols and services is a big deal. So I think, if you can restrict those as well as disallowing multicast and broadcast from occurring on your network, that effectively reduces those types of attacks in your infrastructure. Just by doing things like enabling the Windows firewall can make a big impact on lateral movement and things that we see out there as well. And so only allowing, communication from workstation to servers and ports and minimization of ports on those, getting off of SMB version 1 is obviously a good one as well. Those are all key things that you can absolutely do. Complexity of passwords, if you can't do that, is another way. So when you have the challenge and responses, forcing NTLM-v2 with complex passwords can make it much more difficult for an attacker to actually go and do that. We also have a tool on our TrustedSec website that sends out, it was written by Ben 10, sends out fake LLMNR and NBNS responses to look for those types of things. So more of like a honeypotting, active honeypotting that looks for those types of requests as things go out. So there are definitely ways of remediating, detecting, and preventing those specific things from happening in your environment. But it's very common. We still see that in a lot of customers out there. Very much used, especially when you first plug in or you compromise one system, sit there and run something like Invade or Responder to, capture credentials and look at things, fairly passively. There is some remnants in traffic that you could potentially identify as that's happening, but is something definitely problematic for a lot of organizations out there.
So you mentioned a lot about the prevention. Sorry, Steve, I'm stealing your thunder here. The detection piece of that, it should be going more to the endpoints and everything to be able to detect that. Like network IDS wouldn't be able to necessarily pick up on a lot of that, maybe, depending on how it's configured and all that stuff and the choke points.
There are some ways of detecting. So when you reach out to a server and the problem is, they're emulating legitimate file servers, right? So like, let's just say you're going to DC1, that's one of your domain controller names. The responder tool will automatically respond to saying, I'm DC1, right? So it's already kind of an approved list of servers you're going to, so you can't do a comparison off of that. But what you can look for is the challenge and response codes that are coming from there. And, they're usually set as very easy so that it's easier to crack to do hash comparisons to do better cracking of those hashes. So there are ways of looking at the challenge and responses as a piece there. There's also an event ID that gets created if you establish a connection to a specific server with no username and password. So we'll see a lot of honeypots that once they see a challenge and response, will actually try to connect to that file server with null credentials or credentials that are bogus.
Gotcha. And
if those are successful, that it's a bad server because it's not rejecting those credentials in the first place. So there are some ways of detecting it, but it's really challenging.
Yeah.
Packet captures could help out if you're doing, full packet captures. You can definitely see it from that side of the network side. Endpoints becomes a little bit challenging though.
Yeah. And even on this, with this type of vulnerability in networks, like with everybody working from home now, I imagine it's not as prevalent as it was before when we are just able to plug in a tap into an internal network. Has it got more challenging for like pen tests?
Yeah, work from home has definitely created some complexities, but it's also created some opportunity. I was on a red team recently where it was a customer, and it was funny because it was supposed to start on a Monday, and we started doing some of our OSINT the prior week. And by Wednesday, we had contacted the customer and said, "Hey, we think we found some information here. Is there a way if we start the red team early?" And the customer's like, "Sure, no problem." And by Friday, we had full access to everything, which is great. But one of the things that they had done is their user population. So we had targeted a few users, and we used some of the Microsoft endpoints to brute force usernames and passwords, through Office 365. And we were able to get, I think it was maybe 11 or 12 credentials through brute force that we ran throughout the entire day. And it was scattered, we randomized IP addresses and did all that stuff. So it was very, very difficult to detect as it was going through, and only 1 or 2 attempts per account. And what was interesting about that one is that they had removed multi-factor authentication from their Citrix environment because of the whole work from home issue. So they wanted to make it easier for their users that were now working from home. And so they reduced their security to actually go and do it. And so we were able to Citrix into a VPS that, had an entire accounting system on there that had all their financial data. So, trophy 1, objective, complete. But 2, we were able to get access to a full interactive desktop that was sitting on their internal network. And then from there, establish C2, do privilege escalation, and move out to the rest of the network. Gotcha. So, work from home has created some complexities because things like post-exploitation scenarios around lateral movement becomes difficult because you're not going to lateral move on somebody's personal network. Right. But it really depends on how the network's designed, right? Are they doing full VPN tunnels, right? So can you hit their internal network from the user space, or do you have to use another mechanism to get access to it? And that's why, I think it's really important. If you can develop a work from home strategy that doesn't require full VPNs, you can do most of your services from a cloud infrastructure or more from a zero trust model where you're providing services to the user versus full access. That becomes much more difficult from us from an attack surface to gain access, because we have to, when we compromise one individual user, that one individual user isn't our end destination. We have to move to different systems to get access to the data that we need. And if we don't have the ability to do post-exploitation scenarios like lateral movement, we now have to go into other databases and systems and figure things out. It becomes much more complex for us from an attacker standpoint. So, when you can architect and design your infrastructure from a work from home, even if they're on the internal network, don't give them full ports and protocols. Just provide services that they need, very much like a cloud provider would be. We need to think of our networks, and this goes right into the whole SolarWinds thing as well. Can we architect our infrastructure so that our third-party suppliers of software are in their own individual segment where they only provide the services that they need? Now you're talking about a much more defensible strategy down the road than anything else that we've seen before in the past.
Yep. Yeah, and I think you're right. The whole SolarWinds impact and everything, it's going to cause a kind of questioning on, how much latitude are we giving some of the services, even though we might trust them, we're bringing them into our network to provide a service. Do we fully trust it, especially if there's outside connections coming in, for those different types of services? So that, and I think vendor risk management is going to be more of a pain, especially from the taking in from other customers. I see, we get them, we've done in other companies, anytime you're working with big clients, anytime there's a serious thing out there, you're getting pings. Have you remediated this? You need to respond. What was your response to this? That's going to be more prevalent. I see that growing, from the SolarWinds thing. Anytime there's something out there, it's like, hey, it's 0 day from Microsoft. Have you patched this? You need to write up this 3-paragraph thing, what you did to detect it and remove it from your infrastructure.
We got hit very quickly with customers that asked us, do we have SolarWinds implemented? What's our remediation strategy for that? And so we came, we had to come out with a formal statement, that we didn't use SolarWinds and weren't impacted by it. But that was almost immediate. I think it was the day of. We were getting customer inquiries right away from that. So I absolutely see that as being a big thing, and rightfully so, right? You want to ensure that your partners that you're working with, your trusted third parties, are doing the right appropriate steps to address security concerns that may impact you. And that's why, I really look at SolarWinds as it is a wake up notice for MSPs, for cloud providers, and for software developers, because you have unparamount access to, unprecedented access to people's networks and infrastructure. And that has to be taken with the most amount of security restrictions as possible to ensure that things like that don't happen.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and even if you push that even beyond kind of a vendor perspective, all the third-party software that's out there over GitHub, it's 2 maintainers, maintaining that. are they vetting every single pull request that's coming through, you know, with the code that, you know, from a security perspective, like, yeah, it's
crazy. And, you know, that was always my biggest fear with, you know, all the tools that I wrote from an open source perspective, you know, that somebody did a pull request that I didn't, figure something out that they were doing. And so every pull request that I ever got, I just meticulously go through and I test it out, you know, I'm making sure that I understand exactly what's happening, you know, how many people are actually doing that.
Yeah, but that's for your project. How many, you know, other services are you pulling in from other, you know, components and everything. So, yeah.
Well, this is kind of cool because like this reminds me of like the old school days of security going back like 20 years. You had like these different hacker groups and you know, they came out with these things they were called Zines. And they were kind of like a testament to how skilled of hackers they were. And very different, you know, than now. But there was this one group called Declined, and you know, they had talked about how they had, you know, backdoored. I think it was Debian at the time, and you know, and had gotten into their source code repositories and stuff like that, and said they could push code. And you look at that and you're like, yeah, I mean, like there's so much code out there to slip something into that, and if you don't have appropriate checks and balances to actually vet that code as it's going out from an update mechanism, that's a big problem. And you know, that's the thing. It's, you look at software development, we're trying to get faster with pushing code out to customers with DevOps and you know, agile workflows. We're not getting shorter with that. So code inspections are really limited. I mean, we're pushing features and functionality out and then worrying about security afterwards. And, you know, we may need to reel some of that back in and say, well, we're still going to do agile, but, you know, there's going to need to be an additional step in there from a source code analysis perspective that vets all this code that's going into there to ensure that nothing's happened before we push it out to our customers. And that's a cost, you know, that's a timing cost, you know, to our customers, features, functionality, and releases, you know, that a lot of companies really haven't been traditionally good to do. Because they can't push code out as fast as possible. So, you know, we might have to relook at it and say, is agile the right way? Or can we do like agile modified and say, okay, you know, we're going to have some steps in here to ensure that we're not pushing out bad code out to our customers.
Yeah. And I think, you know, on that point and everything, there's a ton of software out there that will help you scan and go through that pipeline and everything. Not a lot of them do good on like behavioral analysis. You know, they can track, okay, this was an input coming out from, the outside, you're accepting off the URL or something like that, and you're not filtering, or you're putting it straight into a SQL query, whatever it may be, they'll flag on those, you know, type of thing. But if it's just a logic problem, you know, of, you know, you subtracting different amounts of a transaction and you can go into the negative and it will still pass through, they're not going to catch that, you know, type of thing. And those are the issues that, how are you going to prevent against that? I mean, you can do peer review and hopefully that weeds out some of it, but not all the time.
But when you look at the SolarWinds case, when they actually, so they created a section in the code that was, you know, essentially kind of like the exploratory to see if we can do it. And then, you know, that was never caught. There was a big piece of just unused code that wasn't being used. That's something that somebody should have picked up on. But then, you know, the second part of it, when they're actually launching it, I mean, it was pretty obvious that it was bad code, right? I mean, it was just by looking at it, you can tell it's you know, at least from what's been published out, it looks pretty malicious, you know?
Gotcha.
And so, you know, but they had gotten to, I think, the update mechanism. So it was probably after all of the code review components had happened. And they actually were pushing it out during the update mechanism component, which is really difficult to detect against, right? So, you know,
were they signing their code at all?
Oh yeah,
they were signing it.
Yep. So it was right before the signing process. Get in, update it, and then, you know, push out the new releases. So, you know, there needs to be a look at your overall SDLC process of how you're doing things and how you're pushing out code, which I think is going to be paramount for every organization that develops software.
So to piggyback on that, is DevSecOps just too hard for most companies?
So it depends on how big you are, how much legacy code you have. We talk to a lot of different customers, all from the small fintechs, you know, starting up 20, 30 people, have some venture funding, to large companies saying, hey, we're still using waterfall and we're looking to transition. And for those, it's a longer conversation. It's 2-3 year project. We're starting with some, we're just getting into the cloud. And those take a little bit of like getting their head wrapped around of what other challenges and considerations they have going into a cloud environment. For a lot of the smaller ones, we've seen some beautiful deployments of their pipeline, their process, their SDLC. It's kind of check and balance. Sometimes they're lacking on the security, but all those checks, code does not go through without going through X, Y, and Z every single time. Once it hits those checks, it goes into a deployment factor and then goes out to production once all that. And when you get all that enforcement and everything, it's it's awesome. Now, whether you have all the checks or not is another factor into there. Oftentimes that's where, especially my team, when we're looking into, PCI deployments into that, we're making sure that all those security checks are within that deployment there and making sure that, it aligns with some of the standards. So.
Great. A couple of broad.
Yeah, it should be something to strive for. I think it does move your business faster. Obviously, minus the considerations that we talked about that, maybe it should slow down a little bit. Really, it's just about the evaluation of whether you have good checks and balances all the way through the process and the confidence that that's happening every single time, or you have the right exceptions and the right people to approve those exceptions.
So a little bit broader, what more should MSPs, managed service providers, be doing for small and medium business as it relates to security?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that you have to look at, right? One, architecture. How is your infrastructure designed to manage those customers, and what level of access do you have, and who has access to it? And the authentication and logging that goes into that's reviewed and checked. That's often the difficult part there, which is ensuring that person A that's supposed to be assigned to these specific small to medium-sized businesses is actually who they are. So things like multi-factor authentication, validation of who they are, controls around that are really important. I also think the monitoring and detection capabilities around a lot of these MSPs is also really important. There was a big breach from, I think it was Bit9 a number of years ago, where Bit9 was compromised and they didn't have their own software on their own products, right? So, you kind of have to practice what you preach in your infrastructure, and having, high security zones where you're looking for unusual traffic. You monitor your own infrastructure. You're putting appropriate checks and balances for authentication. And I'm not saying, just, once and you're trusted, kind of like the model. I mean, every time you authenticate to a customer's environment, you need to validate who you are as an identity before you do the management and maintenance, of those systems. Process is really important. Incident response capabilities around that. And in the event that there is an incident, to shut down so it minimizes the damage to other customers. One customer should be able to impact another customer. Those are all design decisions that you need to make, very much early up front to ensure that, the level of access that you have is managed and maintained based on the identity of the individuals that you're using and that you're monitoring off of, to ensure that you have appropriate protection. So I think, all of those are key components that make up the overall picture of what MSPs have to do in order to protect their customers.
Yeah, I mean, just echoing a lot of that, it's really what we're seeing a lot is customers are reaching out to them more frequently to say, prove to me you are secure. What methodology are you following for X, Y, and Z type of thing? So we're seeing a lot more customers saying, we need validation because we got 100 requests plus, and we're a team of 10 people. We can't handle this. Like, this is taking up half a resource, and we just can't afford this. So what can we do as kind of a one bang and help, to prove that we're secure without, dealing with each individual request? So that's harder than, it sounds, because some customers will not, be that. When Dave and I work together, we're up to 1,000 requests a year on different customers asking us like how we did with security, what we did. And at that time, we're an FTE and a half just to answer those, even though we did have set responses and things of that nature. There were still unique cases where we had to handle per the contract and everything like that. So it's not as easy as just stating that, but I see more and more that, this is going to be a bigger thing, especially with the SolarWinds, that kind of open up the eyes. Everybody thought like, oh yeah, there is some risk with that. Now it's shown that, yep, absolutely, there's a real risk. I think there are opportunities in the vendor risk management area to consolidate some of that stuff. And there are some players into that, but being able to sign up on a platform and be able to communicate to all your customers, or vice versa, communicate to all your vendors to say, hey, how did you respond to this, and have a uniform like response that you can release and kind of have that management. I think we'll see more of those kind of optimizations in the future. So.
And I think MSP's models are a little bit different than most organizations or companies, because I kind of look at them as like a school. When you're at a school and you're an admin or a security professional at a school, like a college or a high school, your user population is hostile. You have external users that are hostile. So you need to design your infrastructure in a way that assumes every organization that you're monitoring is hostile and has the ability to try to attack you to go to other customers. So it's different threat models that you have to really build out from an MSP perspective to really look at that and say, okay, are we appropriately designed to handle those types of situations? And those are discussions that MSPs really need to have right now if they already haven't, to really try to protect their customers, because, MSPs we had a case over at Binary Defense where there was an adversary that was selling compromised MSP credentials. And we worked with the FBI and, purchased the credentials so we can notify those impacted MSPs, and all the businesses that were associated with it eventually led to an arrest of that individual. But they're absolutely targeting MSPs, because think about it. I mean, if you're a ransomware group and you have access to one customer, or if you're a ransomware group and you have access to 1,000 customers, which one's going to have the biggest return? And that's one thing to remember about something like these supply chain attacks that I really want to hit home with. Not to bring back SolarWinds again, but if anybody out there is doing a drinking game, I apologize. One of the things that we need to look at from a SolarWinds perspective, looking at historical analysis around nation states, is that a lot of attacking groups will try to emulate nation states, and nation states will emulate other nation states. And you look at the success that allegedly Russia had with NotPetya, the Ukrainian tax software that caused massive outages. I think FedEx had over $170 million of damage in under 20 minutes. You look at the success that supply chain attack had, and as well as the level of access that they had with this specific one. Ransomware authors, you go back 10 years ago and you would laugh at them because they'd go after your grandma and they target them, right? But they've changed substantially. I mean, Garmin was hit by them this year. UHS, Universal Health Systems, had outages at all their hospitals where they couldn't receive patients. They're going bigger, bolder, and louder, and their capabilities are very similar to nation states when they're using things like living off the land. They're using their own tooling, weaponization. They're customizing their attacks per week. You look at Emotet and Ryuk, very sophisticated groups that are continuously getting more and more advanced over time. They're definitely looking at these types of situations around SolarWinds and saying, hey, if I could compromise an update mechanism, I can now have access to thousands of people I can ransom at the same time. That's a lot of money that I could be getting back into my business. I think we're all on notice now, not just from nation states and these types of attacks, which, we look at it from a likelihood perspective is relatively lower. We now are looking at that from a ransomware perspective, saying the next year or two, we're probably going to see some of those start to happen from ransomware groups as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, just from my own curiosity, how do you minimize some of that stuff? I think a lot of the propagation of that is because there's no extradition laws in some of these countries where there's source, there's no way, even if we have all the facts, that we're going to get a prosecution. So they're still going to do that, type of thing. So are we going to go into isolation mode where we're blocking off entire countries, but then there'll be other ways to get around that with, hosting it? I don't see where this is going to put a stop to, or slow it down and everything.
I think there's two big things there. One is how do we build defense,
right,
to stop these, right? And we can discuss those all day long.
Right.
But there also has to be strict policy issues that have repercussions and ramifications for these types of organizations. For example, if you're harboring a ransomware group that is causing damages in the United States, the country will be held liable from a sanctions perspective, or whatever you can possibly do to retaliate. And I'm not saying we need to be doing bombs and things like that to
right,
countries. I'm not saying that, but there needs to be direct ramifications for nation states that are specifically targeting private companies. And this is where it starts to get really murky, because you look at what we classify as cyber warfare today. The NSA is hacking into everybody. They've hacked into third-party companies before in order for intelligence purposes.
Yep.
Israelis, UK, Five Eyes,
Iran,
all those folks are all hacking everybody. Iran's hacking North Korea. Everybody's hacking one another, and there's no definition of what constitutes ramifications, right, or retaliation for those types of things. I would say that there needs to be that definition of if you're compromising a third-party company, a private company or private entity,
yep,
either for intellectual property theft, even military preparedness, hacking supply chain infrastructure, that there are direct ramifications for those types of things that make those countries feel extreme amounts of pain because that occurred. And until those things happen, there's no reason why China or Russia or North Korea or Iran don't keep hacking us. There's no reason for them to stop. They're handing us left and right. We have peer competitors in that space. We're not the best. We're peer levels of everybody else on that market, and we're often restricted based on our rules and regulations here, whereas Russia and China are not. You don't call up the NSA and say, hey, I have a competitor over in China. Can you steal all the intellectual property from me so I can compete with them in their own market? It doesn't work that way. So we're at a big disadvantage when it comes to that. And unless we start getting really strong, and this can't be a administration policy. This needs to be something that, is legislature, that is law, that comes from Congress and is passed and is something that holds true regardless of what president is in place. It sets the baselines and guidance for what constitutes international, hacking coming in. There was just an executive order that was released yesterday, and I haven't. I'm sure it's going to be
against China. You're talking about?
No, it was what I still need to read into all the details of it, but essentially what it did is that if there was any foreign entity that was registering infrastructure here in the United States, they had to define who they were, so that they can start to get an understanding or baseline of who is actually registering accounts or using infrastructure here in the United States, so they can go back and target them. I don't really think that's going to do much, and I don't even know how you track that, how do you, you can register.
They just go through a satellite company here or something
100%.
like that. Yeah.
So, I don't really see that as being effective. Like, that's not, to me, that doesn't make a difference in what we're seeing. I think the problem that you really have is that you have a lot of legislatures that don't understand technology, don't understand what cyber warfare looks like. And you have a lot of policymakers that just aren't focused on, the defense of private sector companies. They're more focused on, the political issues that we deal with day in and day out. So until that happens, I don't think that we're going to have a good retaliation response to be able to do that. So our only response to that is defend as much as possible, detect as much as possible, protect as much as possible, so that we can really try to protect against, those types of threats.
And I would agree. I don't think the courage there to address some of that. We still don't have a national privacy. We still don't have a national breach notification law, type of thing. And those are just internal United States stuff. So doing something that's, external to us, I don't see them actually addressing something like that.
No.
So.
All right, bringing it into some of the organizations with operationalized CTI and SIM and SOAR, the Security Orchestration Automation Response, and EDR, Point Detection Response, looking at behavior, what can threat hunters do to separate themselves and provide more value?
That was a lot of buzzwords.
We're playing that drinking game.
We forgot the machine learning and Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies and that. I can start with this one. So when you look at kind of the evolution of where monitoring and detection has really come through, 10 years ago, our focus was very much preventative, building this castle. And what happened is, we would go into organizations and we would just literally destroy an organization. They would fix the technical findings. The next year we go and destroy an organization through new technical findings. They would fix those issues. And it was this cyclical effect of bad practices, within an organization coming to fruition. And with cloud adoption and, moving to different systems, we don't have a castle. We never really had a castle in the first place, but we definitely don't have a castle now. We have an open city with open borders and anybody can come in, right? And with that, our focus has shifted. Protection is still important, vulnerability management is still important, all those core concepts of those basics. And when I say basics, I don't mean basics are easy, basics are hard. But those basics are still important and foundational. But what's changed is the whole component around monitoring and detection. Can we identify an attacker early on before they've had access to our infrastructure for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 6 months or whatever it ends up being, and boot them out to minimize the amount of damage that we have? And so one of the biggest missing links that I think we've always had in organizations is the ability to take data from a lot of different systems, centralize it in a human readable format, and having people proactively looking through that data, i.e. the threat hunting component. Security operations centers to me are a phenomenal thing. However, what happens in most organizations with security operations centers is that they deal with 99% false positives. They get alarm fatigue, and then the one time they actually find something, they miss it. And so you have these folks that are just literally going through alarms all day long, crunching through alarms, and those alarms never get refined, they never get improved. You're never adding new ones to it. So the security operations center and the monitoring detection program becomes very stagnant. And so when you start looking at things like threat intelligence, and I'm not saying threat feeds, those are very different things. I'm talking about actionable threat intelligence, understanding your threat models and adversaries, and having a team that proactively looks in your organization for understanding unusual behavior. I think that's a very strong thing. And when we see a lot of companies that have done very well, especially when it comes to a lot of our tailored red teams or breaches that they've responded to, it's because they have a threat hunting team that's proactive, right? And they're looking through logs. They're looking for east to west traffic, not just north to south. They're combing through DNS logs. They're looking at command line arguments, looking at parent-child process relationships and Markov chaining, looking at service creations. They're going through all the data they possibly can, looking for unusual activity. It's kind of that long tail effect where you have all of your commodity stuff up here, which is your SOC is looking for, and you start getting down here and you start looking for those deviations. That's where things start to become really important. And when the threat hunting team can be the institutional knowledge around the types of attacks and breaches that are occurring in your environment, and when they can improve the monitoring and detection capabilities in your environment, that's a very strong thing to do. SOAR is an interesting topic. I really haven't seen it implemented well in any organization yet. A lot of people talk about it, and I think it has a lot of promise. I look at SOAR as kind of the plumbing with all of your tools to work together. So if you have a SIM and you have an EDR and you have this and this and this, what I see SOAR mostly used for is the ability to interact with those systems and provide certain tasks to the SOC analyst or the threat hunter to be able to enable actions very quickly for them. So, doing things like lookup, reverse lookups, or doing things that might be, manual tasks, presenting that to somebody as a main thing. When I hear a lot of people talk about SOAR, they're like, well, hey, it's going to replace my security analyst and they're going to automatically block this attacker and everything's going to be perfect. I'm like, well, how does that actually work? And how are you actually going to do that? And how are you going to ensure that it's not false positives when you're actually blocking legitimate things that happens all the time? And then they turn it on and it breaks your whole network. So I look at SOAR more as a way to help enrich data than I do anything else, around security orchestration, automation, and response. The response piece is the hokey part in that I don't really see a lot of organizations adopting most of the time. But I think that whole picture there around being able to ingest the data, having the right visibility into your infrastructure, and data is becoming really cheap. So you really should be putting in as much data as possible to be able to come through that, getting information off of the endpoints, and then using your threat hunting team as a way to be proactive. I think that is a recipe for success. And we see that work very well for organizations, both small, medium, and large size. It doesn't mean you have to have a dedicated threat hunting team. I mean, just doing threat hunting exercises, once a week, once a quarter, whatever you're doing, whatever you can do based on time and resources makes a huge impact.
No, that was good. Do you see some of those good teams that have the dedicated threat hunters? Do they rotate off the SOC, or is it the same people doing that all the time?
It's a good question. I do see, I do see where they'll have SOC analysts join the threat hunting team for that knowledge sharing component to really help out. And SOC analysts, you want to look at that as a career progression, right?
That's mainly junior people.
Yeah, like at Binary Defense, for example, a number of our SOC analysts have been promoted to the threat hunting team, where they're active threat hunters, and we do a lot of cross pollination with that. We're running threat hunting exercises. The SOC analysts are assigned to those and can assist and help with those and learn those types of experiences. And the reason for that too. Is it makes them a better SOC analyst. When you're trying to teach a SOC analyst that's a tier 1 or tier 2 SOC analyst, right? There are things that look very legitimate that are malicious, and unless you understand that attack, unless you've seen it before in the past, you may consider that legitimate. And a good example is we had an issue. This is going back years ago, but there was an HTA file that was used, and it was a pen testing team, and we caught it on the PowerShell execution, but we missed the HTA component. So time-wise, we responded just the way we should have, but the analyst marked the HTA as legitimate, and I'm like, well, why did you mark the HTA as legitimate? And on there, the pen testers did a really great job. They looked at Amazon, and Amazon has an ancillary admin backup tool that's an HTA, and the pen testers copied the name of that and put all the malicious code in the HTA file. And when it executed, one thing we didn't do at the time is put the contents of the HTA file in the actual alarm data itself. He had to go to a different tool to actually go and do that.
Gotcha.
Where SOAR kind of comes into place, right?
Yeah.
And so, just by looking at that name, the analyst did what they should have. They looked at that HTA file they hadn't seen before. If I see an HTA file, I'm marking it malicious regardless. I know for a fact, no one uses HTAs, and you should send that off right away, right?
Except Amazon, apparently.
Yeah, except Amazon, apparently. But the analyst marked it as a false positive. But he Googled it, he looked at it, it looked legit. But if we had given him the contents of the HTA file, right, they would have been successful. But if they've seen HTA files in the past and know how damaging they are, they would have been like, well, this is probably still malicious, So that cross-pollination in ways that you can improve is really important. But also, if you learn through experiences, and threat hunting really provides you a way of combing through data, things that might be legitimate and things that might not be, and really being able to learn that very quickly. And I think that cross pollination is really important.
Gotcha.
What should people stop recommending? Either because it's too hard or no one does it, or it just hasn't gained any traction. Is there anything like that? Like, again, segmentation might come up, or whitelisting, anything along those lines?
Yeah.
DLP.
And it's going to be required in PCI 4.0. So.
DLP. I have never in my entire career seen a good implementation of DLP. Have you?
No, I mean,
Where's it at?
I mean, other than maybe accidental email things,
sure.
Those type of things, like, all right,
Aside
don't send out
from,
your
social security number, credit card
number.
numbers, and email, like basic stuff, right? But like when we talked about DLP, and I remember doing assessments like this of like what was recommended by NIST and everything else, and you're like
tagging everything with the classification.
You need to assign classification to all of your data. Then you're going to have, data stewards and owners, and they're going to be the business owners, and the business owners are now going to own the data. The business owners aren't going to ever own the data. Are you crazy?
Plus, while they're still not patching appropriately,
right?
Yeah. So yeah,
I think DLP is one of those things where you get it kind of as good as you can with like some basic stuff. Like, hey, the board member meetings, maybe some of our intellectual property, maybe some social security numbers and credit cards, and there's the LP.
Still hard to do, especially now that everybody's working from home and everything like that. Like you have to put in through choke points and then TLS 1.3 where it's harder to actually intercept some of the data. Like
SSL termination becomes a bitch.
It's going to be hard, type of thing. So I would probably agree with that. Yeah.
I'm still a massive fan of application whitelisting. I think that if I had any protective control that I could implement on an organization, it would be application whitelisting. And the reason for that is that anytime that you can reduce your noise in your environment, that is a better case for your security analysts, your SOC analysts, your team. You have configuration management, and you know where your flaws and weaknesses are when new attacks come out. So if you have good configuration management, which not a lot of companies do, unfortunately, and you can do things like application control and application whitelisting, I still find that as being one of the most effective preventative controls out there today, but I don't see it implemented very often.
Is it because the challenges of like spinning up their own CA or
no,
to sign like the code packages? Like, what is it you think that's not doing that? Just lack of knowledge?
It's the work that goes into having to put in application control. So when you look at that, you have to, put things in monitor mode for a while. Then you have to put it in enforcement mode, and enforcement mode is going to break things because you're essentially blocking how things work on a system. Now, you can put as many exceptions as possible, but the more exceptions you put in place, the more attack surface you have. And and it's just there's so many deviations and exceptions that have been put into place for organizations and companies over time that people are really terrified of implementing. It takes a lot of time. I've only seen one company really put in extremely effective application control that didn't have a lot of exceptions because they had fantastic configuration management. Like all of their users were standardized to the T, and every exception was documented extremely well that allowed them to roll that out. And unless you have that type of thing, configuration management becomes hard. I think it's easier on servers by far. But when it comes to workstations, which is going to be one of your highest attack surfaces,
and everything,
developers, IT,
tools
even doing things like, if you could just cut back on things like living off the lands where, your remote code execution binaries, that aren't run by regular users, that's allowing PowerShell, I'm not saying, PowerShell isn't needed. PowerShell is a phenomenal, scripting language. It's amazing. And one of the most secure out there, especially if you implement things like constrained language mode and everything else. But does every user need access to a full-fledged programming language? Usually the answer to that is no. Does Bob in sales need access to a programming language? No. So
does anybody need macros?
No, and that should be no. Like the fact that we're still discussing macros today is still one of the most prominent methods for remote code execution through Excel or Office products is ridiculous, right? So a lot of those low-hanging fruits, if you could just block a lot of the common attack surfaces like PowerShell, like living off the lands, like macros as an example. Your footprint and your noise goes whoosh, just like that. And all of a sudden now you're just looking for a little bit of information versus this massive ocean of data. Yeah. And that becomes much more easier to maintain than anything else out there, in my opinion.
Yeah. So what new services, I know we have some, or technologies have you seen that are emerging that you think are worth a look?
So I think, obviously there's more and more adoption with cloud and everything. There's a lot of service providers out there that will crawl your entire environment and actually give you kind of that holistic look of permissioning, of different patch management, of different infrastructure improvements you can do. I think that space is only going to grow, because there are, AWS and I think Google are probably the leaders in that. Azure is catching up a little bit, but they're finally getting some more tools, and then, cross mapping to CIS or NIST or things of that nature. But that's only been year and a half that it's made it to AWS. So there are other providers that I think are a little bit faster than going off the native tools and everything. Plus, if you're operating in a multi-cloud environment, you almost need to do that tooling with that. So that's going to continue to grow. Obviously, with a lot of the individuals going to more remote, and it's going to be, I would say, years to back to normal, whatever we quote that as. It's going to be more down to the endpoints, which we've been recommending for years, to get that there. But now it's a necessity, because we don't have network infrastructure to detect some of the stuff and everything. So putting everything kind of on the endpoint and then providing services or different choke points, depending on how your infrastructure is, to look at stuff of that nature. So
I think managed detection response is only going to become more important. I think people really struggle with the endpoints in general and being able to monitor those. I think that the progression around detection is always a good one. I'm really interested in machine learning, not artificial intelligence. I still think that's a bunch of hogwash in the security industry. Good example of applied principles around machine learning is Cylance, where they claimed artificial intelligence. It was big data analytics and machine learning. Artificial intelligence really hasn't made its stamp on in our industry in any way, shape, or form yet. So I'm really skeptical on AI. But when it comes to machine learning and being able to take large data sets and do computation analysis around those types of data sets, I think is really important, because I think you can determine a lot of things. Microsoft uses that very well. There was a talk that they gave, I think it was at B-Sides Israel. And it was just really impressive to see how they apply data models to all the data they ingest, which is also scary, by the way, how much data they ingest from Windows 10. I don't know how that ever happened, by the way, but all the data analytics they perform on that to be able to understand edge cases or unusual activity that's occurring or modifications or things, and being able to automatically attribute those to specific attackers. I think machine learning has a lot of applied principles in our field, but it's very specific. You look at something like Cylance, where when they first came out, it was kind of a new way of applying machine learning to binaries and applications, but it didn't scale at all to scripting languages and other things. And they basically just died off and kind of fell off the earth because they couldn't, expand off of that specific niche thing that they did. And we saw a lot of the attack surfaces shift away from binaries and applications to PowerShell and scripting languages and living off the lands and things to that effect. So they became very much less relevant down the road. So I think machine learning will have a lot of applied principles for us in very specific things that can help us out and make determinations to bubble things up to analysts to make informed decisions or do automatic calculations and analysis for us. But I think we're extremely far off from the AI component. I don't see that being applied anytime soon in our field. And right now it's just a lot of buzzwords that's occurring. But I think, MDR and ML are kind of the two main areas for me.
Yeah, and I would agree with the machine learning. The problem with that is it's not for everybody. It's a big buzzword, but it really depends on the application. What you're talking about.
Very specific niche things that you can.
And you have to have a lot of data to actually do that. If you have 10 customers, you're just making rules at that point. There is no machine learning looking at trends, at that point. So yeah, you have to have a significant customer base with data inputs coming in all over the place, which, if you're talking cloud providers or Cylance or whatever it is, they have that ingestion, and then can make that determinative, perspective there. So yeah, there is a lot of value with that. Like AWS has Macy, and they've been pushing a lot with that and everything. So yeah, yes.
Yeah.
All right, great. We're up against it. So one last one. What is the biggest vulnerability that most organizations have to worry about? Email, Office 365, or just what in general do you see as, in essence, their biggest challenge?
Patching.
I would agree with that. Patching and your endpoints.
Outside. Yeah.
Email is obviously a major concern from a phishing perspective. And even with, a number of layered defenses around, whether you're doing sandbox and personalization, spam filtering, reputational analysis, those types of things can reduce those. But, especially if they're targeted attacks, we still have very limited defenses against those in most organizations and companies. So I think education awareness around that and trying to get as much as we possibly can from an endpoint detection and prevention perspective is really important. So I look at the endpoints as a big piece there. But, you look at a lot of the data breaches, and, once you have access to one system, if your internal network, if you're an M&M syndrome, and, you have your hard on the outside, soft on the inside, the rest of your infrastructure folds. And that's usually from commodity type exploits or attacks that have occurred out there that, have been around for 6 months or longer. The fact that companies still have zero login, which is, privilege escalation from a regular user to a domain admin. I mean, those are critical things in your environment that you have to be able to look at and fix very quickly. So patch management to me is the foundational aspect of any security program, and patching is just a critical piece there for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in any type of security leadership, you should be focusing on, like my last company and everything. The three big things that we focused on was the perimeter, which included endpoints, type of thing, compliance, and our web applications, because we're a big dev shop. Those are the three big things. And then obviously we had a number of things, but those are the things, if someone would fall, those would be in that area, type of thing. So we focused a lot on, patch management, hardening. But one of the things that I think we didn't talk a lot with leadership is, I think a lot of failure in security leadership is coming in to say, we're going to be preventing everything. And there's a lot of expectations that if you're coming in as a senior leader in security, you're good. You're all safe. We're putting in the investment. We're all good having the CISO here, but it should be communicated upward and say, I can't prevent everything. There's a large organization. We have thousands of endpoints. There's some things going that happening. So get our detections in, get our response in quickly. Obviously prevention is really important, but you can't do that with, with all the assets that oftentimes are under control. So.
All right. Well, thank you both very much.
Yeah.
It was fantastic.
Well, I'm gonna do a special thanks to Steve Marshowitz here. We got Chris Besh over here on the side that you can't see. Amanda watching the webinar, make sure we're doing everything. Scott White's on there. So thank you all for coming in and helping out, making this happen. It's a group thing
It's a
here.
great meme out of your talk. So, all right. Thanks so much
All right.
again, and look forward to seeing everyone next time around.
Thanks everybody.
Everyone.
Appreciate it. Don't move.